Chapter 3. Slavery. Perplexing question about American slavery, which has never been altogether explained, and which indeed most Americans hardly know exists, has been stated by Nathan Glazer as follows. Was American slavery the most awful the world has ever known? 12. The only thing that can be said with certainty is that this is true, it was. American slavery was profoundly different from, and in its lasting effects on individuals and their children, indescribably worse than, any recorded servitude, ancient or modern. The peculiar nature of American slavery was noted by Alexis de Tocqueville and others, but it was not until 1948 that Frank Tannenbaum, a South American specialist, pointed to the striking differences between Brazilian and American slavery. Feudal, Catholic society of Brazil had a legal and religious tradition which accorded the slave a place as a human being in the hierarchy of society, a luckless, miserable place, to be sure, but a place withal. There was nothing in the tradition of English law or Protestant theology which could accommodate to the fact of human bondage. The slaves were therefore reduced to the status of chattels, often, no doubt, well cared for, even privileged chattels, but chattels nevertheless. Also focusing on the Brazil-United States comparison, continues. Brazil, the slave had many more rights than in the United States. He could legally marry, he could, indeed had to, be baptized and become a member of the Catholic Church, his family could not be broken up for sale. Many days on which he could either rest or earn money to buy his freedom. It encouraged manumission, and the freedom of infants could often be purchased for a small sum at the baptismal font. In short, the Brazilian slave knew he was a man, and that he differed in degree, not in kind, from his master. 13. 11. United States, the slave was totally removed from the protection of organized society. The elaborate provisions for the protection of slaves in the Bible, his existence as a human being was given no recognition by any religious or secular agency. Totally ignorant of and completely cut off from his past, and he was offered absolutely no hope for the future. Children could be sold, his marriage was not recognized, his wife could be violated or sold. There was something comic about calling the woman with whom the master permitted him to live a and he could also be subject, without redress. Frightful barbarities, there were presumably as many sadists among slave owners, men and women, as there are in other groups. Slave could not, by law, be taught to read or write, he could not practice any religion without the permission of his master, and could never meet with his fellows, for religious or any other purposes, except in the presence of a white, and finally, if a master wished to free him. A legal obstacle was used to thwart such action. This was not what slavery meant in the ancient world, in medieval and early modern Europe, or in Brazil and the West Indies. More important, American slavery was also awful in its effects. He compared the present situation of the American Negro with that of, let us say, Brazilian Negroes who were slaves 20 years longer. We begin to suspect that the differences are the result of very different patterns of slavery. The Brazilian Negroes are Brazilians, though most are poor and do the hard and dirty work of the country, as Negroes do in the United States. They are not cut off from society. Into its highest strata, merging there, in smaller and smaller numbers, it is true, but with complete acceptance, with other Brazilians of all kinds. The relations between Negroes and whites in Brazil show nothing of the mass irrationality that prevails in this country. 14. Elkins, drawing on the aberrant behavior of the prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, drew an elaborate parallel between the two institutions. This thesis has been summarized as follows by Thomas Pettigrew. Were closed systems, with little chance of manumission, emphasis on survival, and a single, omnipresent authority. profound personality change created by Nazi internment, as independently reported by a number of psychologists and psychiatrists who survived. Toward childishness and total acceptance of the SS guards as father figures, a syndrome strikingly similar to the Sambo caricature of the Southern slave. Century racists readily believed that the personality was simply an inborn racial type. African anthropological data have ever shown any personality type resembling Sambo, and the concentration camps molded the equivalent personality pattern in a wide variety of Caucasian prisoners. Was Sambo merely a product of slavery in the abstract? For the less devastating Latin American system never developed such a type. In this line of reasoning, psychologists point out that slavery in all its forms sharply lowered the need for achievement in slaves. Negroes in bondage, stripped of their African heritage, were placed in a completely dependent role. Their rewards came, not from individual initiative and enterprise, but from absolute obedience, a situation that severely depresses the need for achievement among all peoples. Important of all, slavery vitiated family life. Since many slave owners neither fostered Christian marriage among their slave couples nor hesitated to on the auction block, the slave household often developed a fatherless matrifocal pattern. 15. The Reconstruction. The emancipation of the slaves, the Negro American family began to form in the United States on a widespread scale. But it did so in an atmosphere markedly different from that which has produced the white American family. Negro was given liberty, but not equality. Life remained hazardous and marginal. Of the greatest importance, the Negro male, particularly in the South, became an object of intense hostility, an attitude unquestionably based in some measure of fear. Jim Crow made its appearance towards the end of the 19th century. It may be speculated that it was the Negro male who was most humiliated thereby. The male was more likely to use public facilities, which rapidly became segregated once the process began, and just as important, segregation. The submissiveness it exacts is surely more destructive to the male than to the female personality. Keeping the Negro in his place can be translated as keeping the Negro male in his place. The female was not a threat to anyone. Questionably, these events worked against the emergence of a strong father figure. The very essence of the male animal, from the bantam rooster to the four-star general, is to strut. Indeed, in 19th century America, a particular type of exaggerated male boastfulness became almost a national style. Not for the Negro male. The sassy nigger was lynched. The Negro family made but little progress toward the middle-class pattern of the present time. Mead has pointed out that while, in every known human society, everywhere in the world, the young male learns that when he grows up one of the things which he must do in order to be a full member of society is to provide food for some female and her young. This pattern is not immutable, however, it can be broken, even though it has always eventually reasserted itself. Family, each new generation of young males learn the appropriate nurturing behavior and superimpose upon their biologically given maleness this learned parental role. Family breaks down, as it does under slavery, under certain forms of indentured labor and serfdom, in periods of extreme social unrest during wars, revolutions, famines, and epidemics. Periods of abrupt transition from one type of economy to another, this delicate line of transmission is broken. Under badly in these periods, during which the primary unit may again become mother and child, the biologically given, and the special conditions under which man has held his social traditions in trust are violated and distorted. 17. Franklin Frazier makes clear that at the time of emancipation Negro women were already accustomed to playing the dominant role in family and marriage relations, and that this role persisted in the decades of rural life that followed. 13. Country life and city life are profoundly different. The gradual shift of American society from a rural to an urban basis over the past century and a half has caused abundant strains, many of which are still much in evidence. It occurs suddenly, drastically, in 1 or 2 generations, the effect is immensely disruptive of traditional social patterns. Abrupt transition that produced the wild Irish slums of the 19th century Northeast. Drunkenness, crime, corruption, discrimination, family disorganization, juvenile delinquency were the routine of that era. In our own time, the same sudden transition has produced the Negro slum. But hardly better than its predecessors, and fundamentally the result of the same process. Negroes are now more urbanized than whites. Families in the cities are more frequently headed by a woman than those in the country. The difference between the white and Negro proportions of families headed by a woman is greater in the city than in the country. Promise of the city has so far been denied the majority of Negro migrants, and most particularly the Negro family. 1839, E. Franklin Frazier described its plight movingly in that part of the Negro family entitled, In the City of Destruction. Hundreds of thousands of rural Southern Negroes upon northern metropolitan communities presents a bewildering spectacle. Contrasts in levels of civilization and economic well-being among these newcomers to modern civilization seem to baffle any attempt to discover order and direction in their mode of life. 18. In many cases, of course, the dissolution of the simple family organization has begun before the family reaches the northern city. But, if these families have managed to preserve their integrity until they reach the northern city, poverty, ignorance, and color force them to seek homes in deteriorated slum areas from which practically all institutional life has disappeared. At the same time that these simple rural families are losing their internal cohesion, they are being freed from the controlling force of public opinion and communal institutions. Family desertion among Negroes in cities appears, then, to be one of the inevitable consequences of the impact of urban life on the simple family organization and folk culture which the Negro has evolved in the rural South. Contribution of desertions in relation to the general economic and cultural organization of Negro communities that have grown up in our American cities shows in a striking manner the influence of selective factors in the process of adjustment to the urban environment. 19. Concluded his classic study, The Negro Family, with the prophecy that the travail of civilization is not yet ended. It appears that the family which evolved within the isolated world of the Negro folk will become increasingly disorganized. Modern means of communication will break down the isolation of the world of the black folk, and, as long as the bankrupt system of Southern agriculture exists, Negro families will continue to seek a living in the towns and cities of the country. They will crowd the slum areas of southern cities or make their way to northern cities where their family life will become disrupted and their poverty will force them to depend upon charity. 20. Every index of family pathology, divorce, separation, and desertion, female family head, children in broken homes, and illegitimacy, the contrast between the urban and rural environment for Negro families is unmistakable. Into which Negroes began to move early in this century, is the center and symbol of the urban life of the Negro American. Conditions in Harlem are not worse, they are probably better than in most Negro ghettos. Social disorganization of Central Harlem, comprising 10 health areas, was thoroughly documented by the HARYOU report, save for the illegitimacy rates. Now been made available to the Labor Department by the New York City Department of Health. There could hardly be a more dramatic demonstration of the crumbling, the breaking, of the family structure on the urban frontier. And poverty. The impact of unemployment on the Negro family, and particularly on the Negro male, is the least understood of all the developments that have contributed to the present crisis. Analysis because there has been almost no inquiry. Unemployment, for whites and non-whites alike, has on the whole been treated as an economic phenomenon, with almost no attention paid for at least a quarter century to social and personal consequences. 1940, Edward White Back described the effects of unemployment on family structure in terms of 6 stages of adjustment. 21 Although the families studied were white, the pattern would clearly seem to be a general one, and apply to Negro families as well. 2 stages end with the exhaustion of credit and the entry of the wife into the labor force. The father is no longer the provider and the elder children become resentful. Third stage is the critical one of commencing a new day-to-day existence. At this point 2 women are in charge. The fact that relief investigators or case workers are normally women and deal with the housewife. Suffering a loss in prestige and authority in the family because of his failure to be the chief breadwinner, the male head of the family feels deeply this obvious transfer of planning for the family's well-being to 2 women, one of them an outsider. Was reduced to that of errand boy to and from the relief office. 22. Family makes it through this stage back, finds that it is likely to survive, and the rest of the process is one of adjustment. The critical element of adjustment was not welfare payments, but work. Observed our families under conditions of unemployment with no public help, or with that help coming from direct, sick, and from work relief, we are convinced that after the exhaustion of self-produced resources, relief is the only type of assistance which can restore the strained. 15. Family relationship in a way which promises the continued functioning of that family and meeting the responsibilities imposed upon it by our culture. 23. Work is precisely the one thing the Negro family head in such circumstances has not received over the past generation. The overwhelming fact is that Negro unemployment, with the exception of a few years during World War II and the Korean War, has continued at disaster levels for 35 years. Once again, this is particularly the case in the northern urban areas to which the Negro population has been moving. 1930 census taken in the spring, before the Depression was in full swing, showed Negro unemployment at 6.1%, as against 6.6% for whites. But taking out the South reversed the relationship, white 7.4%, non-white 11.5%. 1940, the 2-to-1 white Negro unemployment relationship that persists to this day had clearly emerged. Taking out the South again, whites were 14.8%, non-whites 29.7%. 1929, the Negro worker has been tremendously affected by the movements of the business cycle and of employment. He has been hit worse by declines than whites, and proportionately helped more by recoveries. From 1951 to 1963, the level of the Negro male unemployment was on a long-run rising trend, while at the same time following the short-run ups and downs of the business cycle. During the same period, the number of broken families in the Negro world was also on a long-run rise, with intermediate ups and downs. At the chart not reproduced on page 22 reveals that the series move in the same directions, up and down together, with a long-run rising trend, but that the peaks and troughs are 1 year out of phase. Unemployment peaks 1 year before broken families, and so on. These series in terms of deviation from trend, and moving the unemployment curve 1 year ahead, we see the clear relation of the two otherwise seemingly unrelated series of events. The cyclical swings in unemployment have their counterpart in increases and decreases in separations. recession unemployment on divorces further illustrates the economic roots of the problem. The non-white divorce rates dipped slightly in high unemployment years like 1954-55, 1958, and 1961-62. See Table 21, not reproduced, on page 77. This is expensive. Those without money resort to separation or desertion. Divorce is not a desirable goal for a society. It recognizes the importance of marriage and family, and for children some family continuity and support is more likely when the institution of the family has been so recognized. From these and similar data is difficult to avoid. During times when jobs were reasonably plentiful, although at no time during this period, save perhaps the first 2 years, did the unemployment rate for Negro males drop to anything like a reasonable level. The Negro family. 16. Stronger and more stable. As jobs became more and more difficult to find, the stability of the family became more and more difficult to maintain. Relation is clearly seen in terms of the illegitimacy rates of census tracts in the District of Columbia compared with male unemployment rates in the same neighborhoods. 63, a prosperous year, 29.2% of all Negro men in the labor force were unemployed at some time during the year. Almost half of these men were out of work 15 weeks or more. Impact of poverty on Negro family structure is no less obvious, although again it may not be widely acknowledged. It seemed to be an American tradition, agrarian in its origins but reinforced by attitudes of urban immigrant groups, to the effect that family morality and stability decline as income and social position rise. Over the years this may have provided some consolation to the poor, but there is little evidence that it is true. Higher family incomes are unmistakably associated with greater family stability, which comes first may be a matter for conjecture, but the conjunction of the two characteristics is unmistakable. Negro family is no exception. In the District of Columbia, for example, census tracts with median incomes over $8,000 had an illegitimacy rate one-third that of tracts in the category under $1,000. The wage system. American wage system is conspicuous in the degree to which it provides high incomes for individuals, but is rarely adjusted to ensure that family as well as individual needs are met. Without exception, the social welfare and social insurance systems of other industrial democracies provide for some adjustment or supplement of a worker's income to provide for the extra expenses of those with families. American arrangements do not, save for income tax deductions. Minimum wage of $1.25 per hour provides a basic income for an individual, but an income well below the poverty line for a couple, much less a family with children. 1965 Economic Report of the President revised the data on the number of persons living in poverty in the United States to take account of the varying needs of families of different sizes, rather than using a flat cutoff at the $3,000 income level. The resulting revision illustrated the significance of family size. These criteria, the number of poor families is smaller, but the number of large families who are poor increases, and the number of children in poverty rises by more than one-third. 1 million to 15 million. This means that one-fourth of the nation's children live in families that are poor. 0.24. A third of these children belong to families in which the father was not only present, but was employed the year round. In overall terms, median family income is lower for large families than for small families. Families of 6 or more children have median incomes 24% below families with 3. It may be added that 47% of young men who fail the selective service education test come from families of 6 or more. 1950–60 decade of heavy Negro migration to the cities of the North and West, the ratio of non-white to white family income in cities increased from 57 to 63%. Corresponding declines in the ratio in the rural non-farm and farm areas kept the national ratio virtually unchanged. Between 1960 and 1963, median non-white family income slipped from 55% to 53% of white income. The drop occurred in 3 regions, with only the South, where a larger proportion of Negro families have more than one earner, showing a slight improvement. In general terms, Negro families have the largest number of children and the lowest incomes. Many Negro fathers literally cannot support their families. Father is either not present, is unemployed, or makes such a low wage, the Negro woman goes to work. 56% of Negro women, aged 25 to 64, are in the workforce, against 42% of white women. Dependence on the mother's income undermines the position of the father and deprives the children of the kind of attention, particularly in school matters, which is now a standard feature of middle-class upbringing. The dimensions grow. Dimensions of the problems of Negro Americans are compounded by the present extraordinary growth in Negro population. At the founding of the nation, and into the first decade of the 19th century, 1 American in 5 was a Negro. Declined steadily until it was only 1 in 10 by 1920, where it held until the 1950s, when it began to rise. Since 1950, the Negro population has grown at a rate of 2.4% per year compared with 1.7% for the total population. If this rate continues, in 7 years 1 American in 8 will be non-white. Changes are the result of a declining Negro death rate, now approaching that of the nation generally, and a fertility rate that grew steadily during the post-war period. 1959, the ratio of white to non-white fertility rates reached 1.42. Both the white and non-white fertility rates have declined since 1959, but the differential has not narrowed. Size increased among non-white families between 1950 and 1960, as much for those without fathers as for those with fathers. Average family size changed little among white families, with a slight increase in the size of husband-wife families balanced by a decline in the size of families without fathers. Negro women not only have more children, but have them earlier. Thus in 1960, there were 1,247 children ever born per thousand ever married non-white women 15 to 19 years of age, as against only 725 among white women, a ratio of 1. The Negro fertility rate overall is now 1.4 times the white, but what might be called the generation rate is 1.7 times the white. Population growth must inevitably lead to an unconcealable crisis in Negro unemployment. Most conspicuous failure of the American social system in the past 10 years has been its inadequacy in providing jobs for Negro youth. Thus, in January 1965, the unemployment rate for Negro teenagers stood at 29%. This problem will now become steadily more serious. The rest of the 1960s, the non-white civilian population 14 years of age and over will increase by 20%, more than double the white rate. The non-white labor force will correspondingly increase 20% in the next 6 years, double the rate of increase in the non-white labor force of the past decade. Population as a whole, there is much evidence that children are being born most rapidly in those Negro families with the least financial resources. An ancient pattern, but because the needs of children are greater today, it is very possible that the education and opportunity gap between the offspring of these families and those of stable middle-class unions is not closing, but is growing wider. Is at work. Too many children too early make it most difficult for the parents to finish school. January 1963, 38% of the white girls who dropped out of school did so because of marriage or pregnancy, as against 49% of non-white girls. 25 An Urban League study in New York reported that 44% of girl dropouts left school because of pregnancy. 26. Low education levels in turn produce low income levels, which deprive children of many opportunities, and so the cycle repeats itself. Exception is the rather small impact of the ADCU program since 1961, now expanded by Title V of the Economic Opportunity Act.